Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Yeah, it's really exciting for me to come to BostonCHI. Yeah, so what I figured I'd do is talk about some of our research group's work on user-centered privacy and transparency for online tracking. So I'll actually be presenting three different projects, all kind of smushed together. Um, and then yeah, I'm happy to kind of talk about a lot of these threads that bind all these different projects and kind of my broader perspectives on online tracking and targeted advertising. Right. So I'll just jump into it actually. But first, I'll talk a little bit about our group at the University of Chicago. So I joined the University of Chicago almost 4 years ago as an assistant professor on the Department of Computer Science. And when I joined, I started this thing that we call the U Chicago Supergroup, which stands for Security, Usability, and Privacy Education and Research Group. And we're pretty much, we consider ourselves a research collective. We have 4 PhD students, somewhere on the order of about 20 undergraduates, and a couple of high school students, all working on research relating in one way or another to security, privacy, or HCI. And in many cases, two or even all three of those different concepts. And so just in the spirit of the times, I took a screen cap from one of our group meetings earlier this summer, because our research group, just like pretty much everyone else, has transitioned to Zoom and video calling. Right. And so broadly, we work on a lot of different projects. We work on everything from Internet of Things, privacy and security, end user programming, both for smart spaces, as well as kind of online platforms. Like, how do you tell your computer what you want it to do? We work on fairness in artificial intelligence systems, some interactive AI systems, like, could people actually give AI systems better input or richer input, and would that actually improve both the user experience as well as the algorithmic systems themselves, right? We work on authentication, but one of the main things in our group for the last few years has been online tracking, the subject of tonight's talk. Right. Broadly, with all these projects, including with online tracking, we take a user-centered, data-driven approach to privacy, security, and just in general, how we think about systems. Right. So on the one hand, we like to understand how systems work, but we also want to understand how humans work. Right. And I consider us very much a full stack research group, that if you don't understand both the systems and the humans, you're going to build something that people aren't going to use, or that is not going to be beneficial for society. Right? And we take this joint understanding and we use it to build better tools and systems, like the Tracking Transparency project, which I'll be talking in a little bit about. Right? So online tracking, the subject of today's talk. Right? So you're browsing around on the internet, looking for whatever you're looking for. So like, I spend too much time on hipster music blogs, and as I'm browsing the internet, and as all of you are browsing the internet, companies are tracking what you're doing and associating these activities with pseudonyms, right? So they'll you go to a page for or the first time Google sees you on the internet, it assigns you some long string, some random number, you can think of it as, right? And they start associating all of your page visits with that randomly generated number, right? And so they see me go to this hipster music blog and they say, hey, I bet you like music, right? So there's this process where your page visits are turned into inferences, right? And we'll be coming back to all these things in a lot richer detail, right? So once you have inferences, the company thinks has profiled you, or in some cases you might say has stereotyped you, right? And what this is used for ultimately, primarily, is to target advertising, right? So as we all know, the internet runs on ads financially, right? In large part, right? And as the years go by, ads are becoming more and more targeted, right? So it used to be that you would see just everyone would see the same ads, and then it was, oh, you would see ads based on what you were looking at. So everyone who went to the same blogs would see the same ads, right? But at this point, ad companies can go pick who they want as their audience based on these profiles, right? And so we'll start off here just saying, like, let's think of these as interest profiles. And later in today's talk, we'll actually refine that even further, and I will, in fact, expand that definition. Right, so you have these interest profiles, and so an advertiser might say, I'm going to target this ad to music lovers, right? And so maybe they're going to be targeting guitar ads, or maybe they're just going to be targeting dog bed ads to music lovers. They can target whatever they want, but they get to pick who their audience is, right? And it can be based on interests or a lot of other things. Right? And this is the current online advertising ecosystem that I find so interesting. Right. And we started approaching all these projects at UChicago a couple of years ago with this kind of question of like, well, what would meaningful understanding, what would meaningful transparency about this ecosystem look like? And we particularly wanted to contrast ourselves with the privacy tools that are, pretty widespread, even now, a couple of years later, where you download a thing for your browser, like, Ghostery, Privacy Badger, any of all these other tools, and they basically tell you, OMG, look who's tracking you right now. So you've downloaded this new software, this browser extension, and now you know these 40 different companies are tracking you on this particular page. And that's scary, right? You're like, if you don't have this browser extension installed, you'd have no idea all these companies are tracking you, right? But we looked at this and said, we're HCI people. What do we do with this information as a user? Like, who's BlueKai, who's Chartbeat, who's Dynamic Yield. Oh, and I know who Google is. Google's my search engine in my email, and you forget that it's an advertiser, right? And so we said, well, where do we go from here, right? And so where the first place we went is we said, well, let's say, can we actually provide better understanding? And we built a browser extension that we call Tracking Transparency and evaluated it. So this next portion of this talk will in fact tell you about our Tracking Transparency browser extension and evaluation. And this is a project that was actually led by a couple of undergrads. So Ben Weinschel, who was an undergrad in our group, was actually one of the Computing Research Association's like national honorable mentions for undergrad research, led this project. And he's now actually on the privacy engineering team at Apple. And Miranda Way was also very instrumental in this project. And actually, in fact, in the two other projects I'll be talking about tonight as well. And Miranda joined our group as an undergrad at UChicago and is now doing a PhD in computer science at the University of Washington. And so these are our slides Miranda actually prepared for a talk she gave at the ACM CCS conference, which is Top Computer Security Conference, basically like the a CHI conference equivalent for computer security. And we called it "Oh, the Places You've Been," hinting at a bit of my Ben and Miranda's love of Dr. Seuss from our childhoods. And so as you're browsing the web, as I said, you're put into all these interest buckets. So maybe you're the green eggs and ham person. Maybe you're the person who likes fish. Maybe, well, everyone on the internet likes cats. Maybe you're the type who likes cats and hats, right? But of course, as you're browsing the internet, as I just mentioned, you're tracked by all these different companies, right? And the best privacy tools we have just tell you who is tracking you, not what they know about you or how they learn these things. Right, and we saw that as very much this interaction gap in the world, right? And so there's all these tools you download as browser extensions. They all kind of follow that. As kind of the browser wars continue, you have web browsers like Mozilla Firefox, Apple Safari, Brave browser, and others that are trying to compete against Google Chrome on privacy. So Firefox, the UI UX team, Firefox has been super interested in how do we basically show to users all these privacy features we're building into Firefox and rebranding Firefox as a pro-privacy browser. Similar things are happening in Safari and Brave, right? And so but again, it raises this question of like, what are we trying to communicate to people, about all of this, right? So, typically you go to these websites, you go look up some Dr. Seuss movies on a website on Rotten Tomatoes, and the privacy tool, like my gross kind of stereotype from before, tells you who is tracking you. So this is a screen cap of Ghostery, which is one of the most prominent privacy tools, right? And again, this is what I don't like. I don't like the here's who's tracking you, because what do I as a user learn from this, right? And so the companies themselves, the companies that track you, a couple of them provide what we call privacy dashboards, what others call ad preference managers. And it'll tell you at a very, very, very high level some of the things it knows about you. So, if you have a Google account, you can go sign into your Google account and go look up their ad preference manager and see things, the bins that they've put you into in terms of demographics and interests. Right? But again, it's just telling you, you're in the shopping bin or the cooking and recipes bin, and not why you're in those bins. Like, what did you do online to be put in the cooking and recipes bucket? Or, really, kind of what does this really mean? Okay. So you might say, okay, well, like these buckets sound fine. Like, does it really matter if I'm in the shopping bucket or the cooking bucket? Right, but these buckets are actually really fine grained. So Google has over almost 2,000 different buckets it puts you into. So it's not just like you like cars; it'll dive into essentially like what brands of cars you might like, or like what parts of cars you're interested in. And it gets actually quite specific, not just like you like video games, but maybe you like shooting games, right? And so in some of our prior work, we tried to understand, well, do people feel differently about these different buckets through, and we looked at this through some online surveys, and we found that actually, yeah, people, being told that you're in the video game enthusiast bucket versus the shooting game enthusiast bucket, people were much more comfortable being in the video game bucket because of the negative connotations of liking shooting games. And so there's very much this kind of presentation of self and self-perception tightly tied into these ad interest categories. And again, there's thousands of them. I mentioned there's almost 2,000 on Google. Facebook actually auto-generates some of them based on groups. And so Facebook at one point had over 40,000 different categories that advertisers could target to. And aroused some controversy justifiably when it was revealed that because they were actually auto-generating these from Facebook groups people had made, that there were some pretty heinous groups that had been created. Right, and so what we want is, in this ideal world, is providing users a longitudinal sense about which trackers may have made which inferences about you, right? So that's one way we're different. We want to focus on this what do they know? What have they inferred? And based on which browsing activity. So that is, we want to connect the dots for people, right? And so I'll take you now through a little bit of the design of our tool and then through our user study. Right, so our tool we call Tracking Transparency, and it's a browser extension for both Firefox and Chrome. And the way it works, you download this browser extension, and every page you visit, we're going to take our best guess at trying to put you into some interest categories based on what's on that page. And we're doing this all locally in your browser. So we came up, we don't actually have much transparency into what the different tracking companies, what buckets they put you into. And apologies, a crazy rainstorm has just started in Chicago. So if you hear kind of, if it sounds like the apocalypse in the background, I apologize. Right, so companies put you into these bins. We don't know how they do it. So we said, well, let's make our own inferencing algorithm, and it'll be a bit of a shadow system. We'll try our best to explain what they may be doing. Right, and so we seeded this. We said the categories we're trying to assign people to are these nearly 2,000 Google ad interest categories, right? And we tried a bunch of different topic modeling algorithms. We settled on using TF-IDF. I'll leave out a bunch of these details, right? But what it did is, most of the time, but not all of the time, could assign a plausible interest category based on the text on the page you're visiting, right? And this is all happening if you're using our tool in your browser. So nothing's getting sent to our server. We wanted to make sure it was a privacy protective approach, right? And so furthermore, in addition to just recording which pages you've been on and what they might be about in terms of potential interest category, we say who's tracking you on these different pages, right? So we used a blacklist from a tool called Disconnect, which basically says what are the different tracking companies. Here's some basically, here are the domains used by these tracking companies. And so we take this block list and rather than using it to block, what we're doing is saying, let's just record who saw you where, right? And we also record metadata about the page. Right, so you go to a page, a Wikipedia page about Horton Hears a Who, and you see, our tracking transparency extension in the corner, right? And so what you do, if you click on it, you get a little bit of a summary page about, where you are, what the page may be about. That's our guess at the inference that could be made, and who's tracking. So on Wikipedia, there are no trackers, right? And it just keeps all this information over time. But we look at this initial window, as kind of the portal into our full tracking transparency extension. Right. So if you click on this Open Tracking Transparency dashboard button, it brings you to our full extension, where taking over full screen, where we tell you about what are the different trackers and interests you've seen, right? And what we did is we basically designed this to give you to give the user a lot more insight into what's happening in having their browsing tracked. Right. So we show you, what interests might web trackers think you have. So we use a sunburst, and you can basically you can filter it by the recency of the browsing, the popularity of the page of the inferences. So like, turns out just about everyone gets dropped into like the shopping and online communities buckets, but there's people who are interested in business to business warehousing are much less common. So we want to give people the opportunity to see what makes them different from the average person on the web. Right. We also wanted to show them information about like what are potentially sensitive inferences that could be made from your browsing. And so we relied on some of our past work that I alluded to before, where we looked at people's comfort with these different ad interest categories. Right. So you click on some part of the sunburst, like let's say pets and animals, right? And it'll tell you, here you've been on 79 sites about pets and animals, and 88 different companies have tracked you with this interest, right? And so you can dive in and get some more details on demand. You can find out, which sites were you on that were talking about, where the page itself was talking about pets and animals. Right? And so just to be more specific, we're not going to say, oh, you were on Google, you were interested in search engines. We'll look at the text on the page you were on and try and figure out what it's about, right? And then we also tell you which trackers might think you're interested in pets and animals. But you can also look at this same view from the perspective of trackers. Like for a particular tracker, what do they know about me? And which pages does this particular tracking company track me on? So unsurprisingly, Google tracks you on a large part of the web. So you can go see, and actually our test site, this test extension we had running for a little bit, we had visited almost 25,000 pages, and Google was on quite a lot of them. Right. And so, we again, wanted to show you, well, what might Google know about you in a way that's richer than what Google itself is going to tell you. Right. So we show you what sites did Google track you on. Again, this is stuff missing from Google's ad preference dashboard, as well as things about, what Google thinks your interests are, which is basically our shadow system of what Google might tell you at a much more coarse level. We dig into the subcategories a lot more. But if you click on those, we can actually show you, well, what are the pages you visited that make us think that Google might conclude you like yoga, or you might like guitars, that sort of a thing. Right. So we built this extension. Precisely, my students built this extension, and what we were just interested in, like, well, is this actually achieving its goals of providing better transparency? Right. So we started off, while we were still creating the extension, with an iterative series of usability interviews. And so primarily my student Miranda, went to actually the public library here in Chicago over a series of a few weeks, and would basically bring in 1 or 2 participants a day for the current build of our extension. So we had 13 participants total in this library intercept usability testing model, and we compensated them a $10 gift card for basically using a sample version of our extension and providing feedback on the information that's there. So we actually, in large part, changed the way we explain a lot of aspects of tracking based on these usability interviews. We also changed what was clickable, because the participants in these usability interviews wanted just about everything to be clickable to get more information. And so we did that, which was a very sensible suggestion. Right. So then, once we got to a point where we were pretty happy with, the canonical usability of this tool, we said, okay, well, let's see what impact this has kind of in the field. And we were especially were interested in, well, let's do a controlled experiment to see how this changes people's knowledge and opinions. Right, so what we did is we recruited 425 participants on Amazon's Mechanical Turk crowdsourcing platform. These were all adults located in the US who use Firefox or Chrome regularly, because that's what our browser extension works on. Right, and so we had them sign up, volunteer for the study through a typical consent form process, complete a pre-usage survey that took about 15 minutes, basically about their demographics, some of their estimates before using any version of this tool, about how often they thought they were tracked, and their starting attitudes and knowledge about behavioral advertising or targeted advertising. Right, so then they, in this browser, had our extension installed for 1 week. So just, throughout their normal browsing, it was just there collecting on the client side, all these pages that they're visiting and what inferences might be. Right. And so we collected, as they were doing this, lots of telemetry data, the number of distinct web pages they were visiting to ensure that they were actually, this was, actually a browser they were using regularly, how many trackers they had seen, how many different topics had been inferred. Of course, to protect participant privacy, we didn't send ourselves, what web pages they were visiting or what inferences could be made, but just these raw numbers. Right. And so then after they had used it for a week, we had them basically walk through a post-usage online survey where they clicked through different parts of the extension, explored what the extension was telling them about their browsing and what had been tracked, and then they reacted to a bunch of this in both qualitative ways as well as with the responses on quantitative scales. All right. And so what we did is we randomly assigned each participant to one of a couple of different conditions in the study. As a control, we first made a version of the extension that just gave static information about, what is tracking, what are interest inferences, and how does this work? And so this was, if you just get this page with educational material but no interactive visualizations, kind of how do people feel? Another one of our 6 conditions was we basically just had them reflect on their browsing. So this basically took away everything about tracking and interest inferences, and just showed you basically your browsing, so you could reflect on what you were doing online, right? To compare with sort of the state of the art of privacy tools, we forked Mozilla's Lightbeam tool, formerly called Collusion, where it basically makes a graph of how different trackers connect the different websites you've been on, so that we call our connection graph variant. And then again, using this comparison to tools like Ghostery to tell you who's tracking you, we had this, what we call our tracker list variant. Right, so the more fully featured versions, we had a version of our tracking transparency tool, like what I just showed you, but without any of the inference part. So just a lot of the browsing, the tracking over time, but not what could be learned. And the final version was our fully featured version, which included what could be inferred about you, in our opinion, by these companies. Hey, and so what we found, we'll start with, essentially a little bit about our participants. So we had, as I mentioned, 425 participants who collectively visited over 1 million web pages during this week of the study. And 39% of them use an ad or tracker blocking tool. And so, these, a decent fraction of our participants are already interested in, some of these privacy issues online. Right. And what we found is that the average, mean page had, just over 2 trackers, and the mean participant after the week had been assigned to 59 interest categories. Right. So in other words, participants were using this tool quite a bit on what for most of them seemed like a primary browser, which is what we had asked them to do. From our qualitative results, we found a lot of improved awareness about tracking. So participants were surprised by the amount of tracking. So one participant said, surprised at how much I was tracked by Amazon and Google. So let me just have Zoom covering up part of the quote. I was also surprised to find that I was tracked on over 75% of the pages I visited. Right. Participants were also surprised by where they were tracked. For instance, that live.com is a site with the most trackers. Right. And then, in general, they learned about how tracking was used for advertising. So to quote another participant, everything was pretty surprising, and it feels like my privacy has been exposed. I never knew that companies tried to create ads supported for me based on my recent searches. Right. So we were teaching some participants about online tracking, although as a caveat, most of our participants were already familiar abstractly with the idea that their browsing is tracked. We also taught a number of participants about how inferences are working. So to quote P161, it shows my top interest is shopping, which I didn't figure that to be true since I usually hate shopping. But it made me realize that I do a lot of shopping online now. That's new to me. Right. And so this gets back to a point I made earlier about how, people, it's very much an issue of presentation of self and self-perception. Like, what do the advertisers think about me? And how does that compare to what I think about, myself and what my actual interests are? Right. Because of course, what you do online is probably related to, but not a perfect reflection of your actual interests. You know, you might do lots of stuff for work that has, you know, nothing to do with what you're actually interested in, but it's reflected in your browsing. Right. And so what we found with our standard version, the fully featured version of tracking transparency, is people were much closer to actually estimating how many different trackers they encountered in a week of browsing, although they still actually fell short. You know, kind of starting off, pretty much everyone thought they saw maybe like, you know, a dozen or 2 dozen trackers. By the end of the week, using our tool, people in our fully featured extension were like, oh, this is more like 100 trackers, which is, you know, less than the 150 that were actually tracking them, but close. Right. You know, we're especially interested to see how use of tracking transparency tool changed people's interest and willingness to and intention to use privacy tools. And so, so this was from a Likert scale response to the statement that the participants were going, you know, whether they would be more or less likely to use blocking tools, you know, tracker blocking tools after using this extension, right? And so the shades of blue represent those who are more likely to use these blocking tools, these privacy tools. And you see, starting off, well, the conditions are in the same order as before. Kind of our controls, static and browsing, are, you know, the least blue. So, you know, least the smallest fraction of increased intention to use blocking tools, whereas our more fully featured version, you know, the version with no inferences and kind of our fully featured version are the ones, you know, with the most, particularly with the standard version, you know, the most who are much more likely to use blocking tools, right? So seeing essentially these details of tracking is making people more likely to want to block tracking. And similar, we see a similar pattern for using private browsing. So essentially, as you go down the list again, it's more of the features of our tool, and you see a larger fraction of participants are intending to use private browsing after seeing all these details about their, you know, how they're tracked over time and what can be inferred about them. Right. So broadly, so we built this platform to show users data about tracking in their own browsing, right? And it increased awareness of how inferences are made and improved their ability to quantify tracking, right? And these longitudinal visualizations, our fully featured tool, increased intentions to take these privacy-preserving actions. Right. That said, you know, coming into this project, I'd actually been hoping it was going to have an even starker impact. And so a group of my students were building a tracking transparency version 2.0 right now. So in the coming year or two, we hope to have a new version of our tool and see if we can actually increase intentions to take privacy-preserving actions even more. Right. And so, you know, that said, we've open sourced the current version of the extension, the one that we evaluated in this paper. It's on GitHub, you know, git.io/tracking transparency. If you want to play around with the code or if you want to kind of install a demo version of our application. Right. And so from this, you know, this is giving one sense of, you know, our work. But I wanted to turn actually to some, you know, related but distinct studies where we look at different variants of this tracking ecosystem. Right. So here we said, like, let's build a tool to increase transparency and help teach people about tracking and what's going on, right? But then there's this question of like, well, how do people generally feel about tracking? You know, and especially like where, you know, will tracking get to a point that people are going to take privacy-preserving actions because they're so creeped out, right? So next we're going to present a paper that, you know, was accepted at the CHI conference this year, would have been presented in Hawaii, but of course that didn't happen because of COVID. And this work was, you know, led by students in our group, Julia, Miranda, and Sophie. And Sophie is actually here to present the first bit of this presentation. And just for a little bit of context, Sophie is just a third-year undergrad and is already an experienced researcher and leading a number of projects in our group. So happy to have Sophie here. So Sophie, go for it.
Thanks, Blase. So the rain is getting kind of crazy here too, so sorry about the background noise. So as Blase said, we'll start with advertising. In the old days, ads were targeted to broad, heterogeneous audiences, like this highway billboard, which encourages anyone who passes by to book a vacation to Hawaii. But recently, the personalization of ads has increased. Take this internet ad, for example, that says, Sophie, plant enthusiasts like you love Hawaii. Book your flight from Chicago today. Prior work has shown that people can find personalized advertising creepy. One explanation is that personalized advertising demonstrates a potential misuse of data in which information collected in one context is reused in another, advertising. We wondered, how would you respond to seeing your data recontextualized in a hyper-targeted ad? And what might you do to prevent unwanted reuse of your data in the future? We reasoned that one strategy might be to disclose less information. From these questions, we developed more specific research questions. Would seeing a hyper-personalized creepy ad make participants feel that their privacy had been invaded? And if so, would they disclose less information in response? We designed an experiment in which we showed participants either a generic control ad or a hyper-personalized ad. We then asked a series of increasingly invasive questions. Each question had a prefer not to say option. I'll then pass it back to Blase, who will give more details of our methods.
Thanks, Sophie. And Sophie will actually, in fact, be back for the next paper too, because as I mentioned, Sophie's contributing to a lot of projects in our group. Great. So what we did in a little bit more detail was a human subjects experiment following a deception protocol. Right. So as Sophie mentioned, we wanted to be able to send participants in the study a hyper-personalized, kind of creepy advertisement. Right. And so, of course, to send a hyper-personalized ad, we would need to know how to personalize it. So part one of the protocol was designed to collect information to personalize this ad. Right. And then so that people would forget that they gave out this information, first of all, we embedded the questions that we used amidst a bunch of distractor questions. And in addition, we waited over a week for the second part of the study, where we would actually show people the ad and then have them, among other things, answer potentially invasive questions. Right. And so because it was a deception protocol, we couldn't reveal the actual purpose of the experiment, or what was going to happen. So while this was actually basically the impact of hyper-personalized marketing on information disclosure, we framed the study as survey about the interests and experiences of Americans. And we actually first did the study as researchers from the University of Chicago, and then in analyzing our results, actually wondered to what degree saying we were from UChicago influenced the results. And so we actually redid the entire study. We made up an organization, the Institute for Interest in Demographics Research, which we briefly thought of calling ourselves Oxford Analytica, and then decided that would be a little too obvious. Right, so we made up this IIDR organization. I mean, Sophie, for instance, made a web presence for our fake organization, right? But we intended it as essentially a generic, slightly sketchy, research organization. Right, and again, so part one, we gathered, obtained consent and gathered information without arousing suspicion, and we got amidst all these distractor questions, the participant's first name, their phone number, their relationship status, their preferred cuisine, and whether they were in a romantic relationship, and if so, their partner's first name. We also IP geolocated them, so we knew the location from which they were taking the survey. Right, and so then, again, we waited over a week, and then they came back for part two. And each participant was randomly assigned to see either a banner ad or receive a robotext, as the main intervention in our experiment. Right, and in addition, to show you a little bit about the creepy version of this ad. So a participant might see something like, Taylor, treat Ryan to a date night this week in Memphis. We know you love Thai restaurants. Use supereats.co to reserve a table at one of the 7 near you for a deal. And so you'll notice this hyper-personalized ad has the recipient's first name, their romantic partner's first name, where they are, their location, and their preferred cuisine, right? And so this was the targeted banner ad. And again, this was a controlled experiment. So half the people saw a targeted ad, the other half saw a generic analog. Just treat yourself this week. Just use supereats.co to reserve a restaurant near you for a deal. Right, and as I mentioned, half the people got banner ads, and banner ads are cool because they're, in the same context where people are doing the survey. And we actually set up our survey software, Qualtrics, to show these as sponsor ads, right? And but of course we were worried initially that people were going to associate that with like, hey, this is a research study, you're just showing us ads. So we wanted to try something where people would get ads, in a different modality, right? So, my students actually set us up with a robotesting service API, and so people got robotext if they were in that group, from a short code number, a 6-digit, number, like the kind you get advertisements from, or for, I know many of us have been getting lots of political ads over the past few months. And again, exact same text for the personalized or generic advertisements, just delivered over a robotext. And we designed the study protocol such that we asked a question about your phone's battery life, or battery percentage currently, to try and nudge participants to actually look at their phone while they were taking our survey at the appropriate moment. Right, and so in short, basically half the participants saw a banner ad, half saw a robotext. Within each of those groups, half the participants were again randomly assigned to see a personalized ad, which we intended to be creepy. The other half saw this generic ad, right? And so then in the second part of the protocol, again, like you signed up, you did a page of questions, and then being on the second page of the survey triggered you to receive, either the banner ad or get the robotext sent to your phone, right? And then we asked a series of 43 invasive questions, right? And so these invasive questions we took from everything from the U.S. Census to Facebook quizzes to Cosmo, right? And they ranged from the not especially sensitive to years of experience with the internet to things like your home address, questions about sex, drugs usage, your mother's maiden name, things like that, right? So again, a series of 43 questions of increasing invasiveness. And as Sophie mentioned, each had this conspicuous prefer not to say option. And we explicitly told participants multiple times throughout this online survey that there was no penalty for selecting prefer not to say, right? And so overall, our hypothesis was that people who had seen this creepy ad would be more likely to click prefer not to say, because they've just been creeped out by their personal information being used for ads. Now someone else is asking for their personal information. That was our hypothesis, right? So at the end of this online survey, people got to the last, what they thought was the last page, and we had a debriefing procedure automatically where we revealed we're actually the UChicago, not the Institute for Interest in Demographic Research, and that we're the people who had sent the banner or robotext ad. And then at that point, we asked a number of questions related to the protocol about, whether they had, remembered seeing that ad, at the appropriate point in the study, whether they suspected it was related to the study, and then what factors they considered when choosing whether or not to answer these potentially invasive questions, as well as whether they answered any questions but did so inaccurately. And again, we emphasized that there was no penalty. We actually configured Qualtrics to show people their answers for all of these, potentially invasive questions, and they could tell us which, if any, were inaccurate. Right, and so of course, this is a very complicated deception protocol with a lot of landmines. And while we were interested in these broader questions about how people think about privacy and targeting online, we were worried that we were going to design a protocol that itself was privacy invasive. So we took a number of steps to mitigate these concerns. So Prolific, which is a competitor to Amazon Mechanical Turk, has what's known as a deception filter. So you can actually limit your study only to people who have basically in advance when they signed up for the Prolific platform said they were willing to participate in deception studies. We work closely with Prolific, which normally does not let researchers collect personally identifiable information from participants to explain what we were doing. We went through some iterations with them, and they approved our use of collecting personally identifiable information for this particular protocol. Any participants who dropped out during the study and didn't reach the automated debrief, we actually reached out to. And we also deleted at the, as participants were on the last page of the survey, deleted all of their answers to the invasive questions and retained only whether or not they had answered the questions. All right. So what did we find? And again, we had hypothesized that people who saw the hyper-personalized ad would find it would perceive it as creepy and would also be more likely to say prefer not to say for these invasive questions. Right. So the first part of our hypothesis was supported. You know, a little bit first on a meta point, we found we went to see like did our deception actually work? Did our intervention actually work? And so over 60% of participants in both the robotext and the banner ad group saw the ad at the appropriate moment during the study and did not suspect that it was related to the study, right? And so in other words, our protocol, you know, for the majority of participants worked, and actually the rest of our analyses, we excluded data from people who had not seen the ad or who had suspected that the ad was related to the study, right? And so overall, we found that participants were on average quite creeped out by this ad. So, you know, we asked questions, you know, about their participants' reactions to the ad. It was just a free response question, like, how did you react when you saw the ad? And 53% of those who saw a banner ad, 44% who saw the robotext ad, in this kind of very vague free response, reported strong negative emotions like being scared, concerned, shocked, surprised, creeped out, or uncomfortable, right? And we actually had some participants reply to the short code texting service. You know, one you know, participant, you know, thinking we were a food review company, said we're going to blast your company on Twitter. You know, we had other people accusing us of being everything from, you know, Grubhub gone evil to Google texting them. And so in short, participants did not like, you know, on average, these hyper-personalized ads, and often wondered where, you know, how a company had gotten such personal information, right? And so, you know, just to quote one of our participants, I was quite alarmed by the ad, wondering how it knew my spouse's name and my location. I was disturbed and put off by it, right? And so again, these are the things participants wrote when we just asked generally, what was your reaction to the ad? Okay, so people were creeped out. You know, broadly, we'll first look at how often participants answered questions. So actually 100% of participants answered questions about their years of experience with using the internet. The majority answered questions like, you know, for what reason did you last cry? And then, you know, I guess I had assumed going into the study as a privacy researcher, no one would tell us the first and last name of their closest friend. Yet 41% of participants across all conditions actually did do that. And in fact, you know, 36% of participants answered accurately. So most of the people who answered this question actually told us the actual first and last name of their actual closest friend, right? And even things like, I thought, again, no one would answer their home address. You know, 15% of participants, you know, answered this question, right? And so we were actually quite surprised, you know, that these potentially invasive questions, even the very invasive ones, you know, some fraction of participants were willing to answer in this online survey. So now to kind of our main research question: would people be, you know, less likely to, you know, answer questions if they had been creeped out by the ad? And the answer was no. You know, most participants answered most of the questions. So again, there were 43 questions, and you see on the x-axis, it was like on the order of like 37 or 38 out of these 43 questions were answered by the median participant. And that was pretty consistent across groups, you know, robotext, banner ad, generic versus personalized ads. And again, you know, we thought personalized ads would be a lot lower because they were creepy. And that's not what we found. People were creeped out, yet they, you know, when they just, you know, minutes after that were asked by someone else for their personal information, they often gave that information away. Right. And so there's, you know, we were just wondering, like, why are participants, like, you know, telling us this information? And we actually broke this, you know, we unpacked these results through a number of different lenses. Everything from, you know, they wanted to do a good job on the survey because they were being compensated, or they were in fact worried about maybe not being paid, even though we told them it was okay to prefer not to answer. You know, they were just worried about having the work rejected, which is part of the pressures of being a crowd worker. You know, some people were actually, you know, performing what's known in the literature as privacy calculus. So to quote one participant, it's impossible to really know where the data goes after you leave it. It's very unrestricted territory. But the fact I get compensated makes me feel justified in taking any risks. Google takes all day, so does Amazon, so do many others. I don't get paid for that. So even though they were getting paid small amounts of money, they were willing to give away sensitive information because they said, well, I normally have this sensitive information collected and I don't get anything in return, right? We had some lessons for crowd working platforms. Like people just assumed because this was on the prolific, crowd working platform, someone must have vetted the study. Of course, no one had vetted the study. Well, our IRB had vetted the study. Prolific had actually vetted the study. The participant didn't know that, and most studies on Prolific are not vetted by anyone. You can just sign up and pay people to take your study, no matter who you are. Right, and so broadly, we can think of this, study as looking at questions about information flows. We have information collected in one context being misused, arguably, in a different context for personalizing ad. And so we have, I can talk at great length about, how this fits into Helen Nissenbaum's theory of contextual integrity, privacy being contextual integrity. That we think about privacy as appropriate flows, basically work within social norms, right? And so, this was a case where it was arguably an inappropriate flow of information, right? And so broadly, we found actually not what we had hypothesized to find in the study, but something that, as we kind of pulled it apart, it turned out to be a lot more interesting about how people think about their privacy online. Right? And that really emphasized for us, all this work we're doing about thinking about, online tracking and what advertisers know about you. And so that takes us to the third and final study, which I'll go through in probably about 9 minutes or so. And it's about what Twitter knows, basically characterizing ad targeting practices, user perceptions, and ad explanations through a user's own Twitter data. Right, and so we've been talking this whole time about targeted advertising, and I've with the tracking transparency plugin extension, we talked a lot about interest-based advertising, right? But of course, you can be targeted ads based also on your demographics, but it turns out quite a lot more. So my student, former student Miranda, had been targeted ads on Twitter for Heinz ketchup. And you just see an ad on Twitter for ketchup and you're like, oh yeah, everyone's getting a ketchup ad. Right. And as it turns out, as Miranda dug into it, she found out that she was on a list uploaded by Heinz or by Kraft of organic and natural ketchup buyers. So someone had actually taken either her email address or phone number and probably from like a grocery store loyalty card and said, hey, this person bought organic and natural ketchup. And so now Miranda was being targeted, was being profiled as an organic ketchup buyer, targeted ads because of that, without realizing it. This particular ad was targeted actually on over a dozen criteria. And the way we found this out is one thing that's come out of privacy law in the last few years through GDPR in the European Union and CCPA in California is consumers have a right to request their data in most cases from companies. And rather than trying to figure out who actually lives in California and who doesn't, a lot of companies have opened it to everyone. And so you can go and download your Twitter data. And what's really interesting there, if you download your Twitter data, is you get a big JSON file that includes, among other things, a JSON object for every ad you've seen on Twitter in the last 3 months, including how it was targeted to you. And this is actually more, as you'll see in a second then, the ad explanation on Twitter where you click, why did I get this ad, will tell you. Right, so we said, hey, we can download our own Twitter data and understand how ads were targeted. So broadly, what ad targeting mechanisms exist and how are they used to target Twitter users? And also, what do people think about these mechanisms for ad targeting and transparency? Right, so what we did is we designed a study protocol where people would request their own Twitter data, upload the ad-related portions of it to us, and that would spawn a customized survey about what was in their own file and the ways in the ads they were receiving and how they were actually being targeted. Right. So broadly, what ad targeting mechanisms are actually being used. So I'll go through this quickly. Our participants were long-term Twitter users. The mean participant had been on Twitter for 6.5 years. And the mean participant saw 1,000 ads in the last 3 months. And so our 231 participants, were active on Twitter and saw a lot of ads. And so across actually all of our participants, we observed 240,000 ads that were targeted in at least one way, right? And so, and we actually saw, with the different targeting types, which I'll define in a moment, 45,000 unique instances of targeting types, like targeting to location equals Boston, right? And so there are things like targeting based on language was super common. Targeting based on their platform, like what device you're using, your location, also reasonably common. But there's this long tail of ways on which you can be targeted, like whether or not you have a new device, as judged by Twitter. Right, and so there is, we've talked a lot with tracking transparency about behaviors and interests. But also there are things like follower lookalikes. So you can target to people on Twitter whose activities make them look like people who follow Taylor Swift, right? So there's a couple of layers of indirection. So you're not actually following Taylor Swift, but you're, in some ways, what you do on Twitter looks similar to Twitter as those who do follow Taylor Swift, right? But it's not just stuff on the platform. It could also be things like, like what happened to Miranda. An advertiser collects, from some offline source, what you've done puts you on a list, right? And so we saw, in these like over 40,000 different, unique instances of targeting, some things that actually violate potentially Twitter's own policies about targeted ads. So you're prohibited to target based on what Twitter says on the platform by race, religion, sex life, health, politics, and financial status. Yet we saw advertisers targeting to things like keyword unemployment, gay, hashtag African American, Latinas, the Liberal Democrats political party in the UK. I mean, people were uploading lists about like, these are people, the PII of people who have a balance due on their accounts. They had one advertiser uploaded Christian audience to exclude from their advertising campaign. There's another LGBT suppression list, again, excluding people from their advertising campaign. Right. So then we had this question, well, what do Twitter users actually think about these things? Right. So we showed all these different ways that participants were being targeted according to their actual Twitter data. So this is how they'd actually been targeted. And so when you ask people broadly, which we did at first, like, how do you feel about location-based targeting? And then afterwards ask them about specific instances, like you were targeted this many times based on location equals Boston. How do you feel about that? People were much more concerned about the specific instances of targeting. So that is, they were much more likely to, be comfortable saying I'm, with being targeted by location, but less comfortable with location equals Boston, right? And so then, we had this question of like, well, how do you provide transparency? Going back to our first talk, and so actually I'd like to let Sophie take over from here.
So to explore transparency in advertising, we explored the design space of ad explanations. So we started with Twitter and Facebook's current practices. At the time we ran this study, most Twitter explanations gave very little information about why a particular user saw an ad. Most just included interest buckets, broad age ranges like 18 and up, and city level location, despite the rich variety of targeting mechanisms that Blase showed earlier. Facebook gave a little bit more detail. They explained custom audience lists like the organic ketchup buyers in this timeline format, plus the other targeting types that Twitter used. After considering current ad explanations, we wondered, how can we do a better job explaining all reasons the user ad without overwhelming them? To that end, we designed 3 speculative ad explanations to test some initial attempts at making more meaningful transparency. So first, detailed text includes information about follower lookalikes and tailored lists, as well as age, location, gender, and interests. Detailed visual included the same information as detailed text, but with blue buttons and clip art to test a visual medium. Detailed visual also explicitly stated when a targeting type was not used, whereas detailed text simply omitted it. Finally, we designed a creepy ad explanation meant to probe the upper bound of the level of detail that might be included. The creepy explanation featured additional information, like the exact time the user saw the ad, their device, and even their IP address. This explanation also used stronger language than the others. You are seeing this ad because you are interested in health news, instead of you may be seeing this ad because Postmates wants to reach people interested in health news. Finally, we made a control explanation that provided no meaningful information as to why that particular ad was chosen. To test these explanations, we used participants' actual data. We showed them an ad that was actually served to them in the past 90 days, followed by an ad explanation populated with the correct targeting criteria associated with the ad. All participants saw all 6 ad explanations in a randomized order. After each one, we asked if they found the information useful and if they would want a similar ad explanation on Twitter. Unsurprisingly, the control performed the worst, followed by Facebook and Twitter. Detailed visual outperformed detailed text. In our qualitative responses, we found that, as expected, people liked having more information and preferred the visual format to the wall of text. But people also liked that detailed visual noted when a particular targeting type was not used. Interestingly, our creepy explanation was the favorite. We hypothesized that the extra information might be too off-putting and overwhelming, but we found that participants really did want to know what the advertiser knew.
Thanks, Sophie. So overall from the study, a main key takeaway for us was that transparency is key, especially as we're giving people these data access rights in laws like GDPR and CCPA. We want to, provide meaningful transparency to people, right? And so even though you could download your data from Twitter, you'd have to go search for this data, right? It's kind of a meta point. Understanding what this data means sometimes is very onerous. So, when we first, got our own data from Twitter, we saw in the JSON key, match targeting criteria, which raised the question for us: are these the targeting criteria that were matched to you specifically as a user? And we wanted to make sure of this before we actually, wrote a paper saying that that's what it seems like it is. So we actually sent, some formal requests to Twitter and their lawyers, and it actually took over 4 months to get a satisfactory reply that yes, match targeting criteria means what you think it means, right? And so, of course, the average user is not going to do something like this because they want to know what's in their data, but they're not going to spend months trying to figure out what's in their data, right? And so this raises a lot of questions, which is why I put this talk last about, well, what should transparency look like kind of as we move forward in the future, right? And so, just to see a little bit of the Q&A, ads have been very much in the news lately in terms of political ads. So Facebook actually, and Google as well, provide this dashboard where you can see an aggregate information about ad campaigns about political ads. So like things like, how much money has been spent, who has been targeted by a particular ad campaign. And this is actually a group at NYU is running this particular implementation, working with the journalism site ProPublica, right? And for those of you who follow the news closely, you might have seen about a week and a half ago, Facebook sent a cease and desist order to the NYU researchers doing this, saying you must stop basically tracking, the information that's on there, because it turned out that the information that was in Facebook's political ad dashboard was sometimes, arguably misleading about how things were being targeted. The NYU researchers were getting data. People volunteered to send their Facebook ad data to the NYU researchers. Right, so this raises these questions of like, what should transparency mean like for privacy online? Should each person be focused on getting an explanation for every ad they see? Should we think about campaigns in aggregate? Should we have people looking out for the creepy things on our behalf? Like, should we be outsourcing this to the New York Times ProPublica, where they do the digging with lots of people's data and try and see what's creepy? Should we outsource this to researchers, right? And so, yeah, so maybe let's turn it over to the Q&A, but I just, like to really quickly thank, the students who, did the vast majority of the work that we presented, Miranda, Julia, Sophie, lots of other students, and more broadly, my students in general. And yeah, so let's move to Q&A.
The first question on my list was from Matthew. Is Matthew here now that he can hear me asking?
Yes, I hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, do you want to pose your question?
Oh, sure. I was wondering if you could review technical details of how the tracking usually is accomplished in detail, though, and I'm not asking for a long discussion of it though. And also I'm interested in unusual or new techniques that are now being tried or used for accomplishing this tracking. So for example, if I clear my cookies often, will that have a major impact or negligible? Is just one thought that goes through my mind, which I could deduce from maybe the details of how it's typically done.
Sure, great. Yeah, great question, Matthew. So kind of in brief, the canonical way tracking is done is indeed through what are known as cookies. And so this is, a way for your web browser to what's called keep state, with different web pages. So this is like, let's say you log in and then now you're logged in with every time you request a new page, essentially some token is stored in a cookie on your browser. And that gets sent along anytime a request is made to anyone on the web, all the cookies are sent along, right? And so, so to keep this from becoming like an hour-long answer, privacy advocates will say, clear your cookies. And if you do that, of course, then you're you would think you're starting from square one with being tracked and with profiling, but that's not quite right. So first of all, if it's a company where you have an account, you clear your cookies, you log back in, and now they know, oh, that old cookie was associated with your account. This new cookie is associated with your account. They can put them together. With browsing, people started blocking cookies from known trackers, and now browser fingerprinting is kind of the new, cool thing to do if you're trying to track people. And so what it'll do is kind of look at essentially contact clues from your browser. So everything, from how big is your screen, like things like that are useful for web pages to know. But then, if you have a weird screen resolution, it'll track that. If your browser is in a weird language preference, it'll track that. It's some of the more pernicious ones are which fonts you have installed. There's actually some really clever ways to figure out which fonts people have installed. Is uniquely identifiable. So there's a project out of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, called Panopticlick. And so I encourage you to go there and see kind of how browser fingerprinting is done, right? And so as with these projects, since we were focused on kind of user perception, we were less interested in kind of the mechanics of how all this is done. Although some of my students, Julia and Ali, have a big project deep into the guts of web browsers, looking at how you can block some of the stuff and how you can detect if it's breaking websites when you're trying to block stuff. But yeah, happy to talk more offline about that.
Great. Okay, the next question was I'm sorry.
Did you prefer I not make a follow-up question on that, or?
No, that's fine.
So I assume that a page has to request the cookies in order to get them. And so another page wouldn't know about those cookies unless it has some implanted code on it to request it. I'm also under the impression that a request by a page for cookies doesn't get all of them, only gets the ones that are requested. And then that's even further limited in some cases by the cookie permissions. I'm not sure of the detail of that. So that's one part. And the other part is there a way to camouflage the fingerprinting?
Great, yeah. So the super short answer to that is you're right. So it's all governed by what's known as the same origin policy on web browsers. So Google can see Google's cookies, Amazon can see Amazon's cookies. It's all bound to that. But like when you go to a page, like if you go to like NewYorkTimes.com, you'll actually see that being on the NewYorkTimes.com or BostonGlobe.com sends requests to a whole bunch of different pages, because like it's essentially a web page is kind of like a Franken page.
Yes, I know.
Parts of it are all coming from different, and essentially, when you're on BostonGlobe.com, it sends something out to Google. There's what's known as the referrer tag as part of the HTTP request, and so it sends the cookies. It knows what the referrer is, and then how do companies match profiles? There's a whole big technique known as cookie syncing, which I'd be happy to go into offline. But it's very much an arms race, super technical in the weeds, which I really like. But I think from the user perspective, users don't want to worry about these technical parts. They want to just say like, I don't want to be tracked. And so there was a do not track proposal about a decade ago at the W3C standards body, and that was it became a big political process and does functionally nothing for user privacy at this point.
I think that's because it's voluntary. Is there a reference for that kind of good detailed information?
Sure,
Since
yeah,
I would assume some of the people watching this might actually be interested in the technical aspect too.
yeah, I'll drop some links in, into the chat after we go through some more questions.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthew. Is Kate Corey Aubrey here? Okay, maybe not. So Kay's question was, did many participants agree with the tracker generated profiles?
Right. Yeah. So we found actually it's kind of a mix. We asked questions in like the Twitter study about the accuracy of the profiles, and it was if I recall, it's like a majority, but far from an overwhelming majority, said that they were accurate. And similar results actually. There's a group at Northeastern that does real great work on basically tracking protection, and they've done similar things where they had people go look at their ad preference managers to see how often they're right, and like they are sometimes right and sometimes completely wrong. And it's so I actually on the one hand, like the more people learn about how wrong a lot of these profiles are, you would think that people are like, oh, this is good from a privacy perspective if they're so bad at creeping on me. But then actually this comes back down to your presentation of self, of like people seem like, surprising to me, a lot of people seem to want to have their profiles be right because that's who they are. And so yeah, kind of accuracy and privacy and the fairness of all this gets all very mixed together.
Okay, I had Peter Barstein's had a question. Peter, did you want to ask your question?
Yes.
Which I'm not saying no. Okay.
What would you recommend for someone who is new to this, who wants to get on the web and find out who's tracking me and what are they tracking?
Great. Yeah. So it was a little hard for me to hear, but I think it was like kind of as a novice, what do you do if you see this and are kind of perturbed? And so was that right, Peter?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So I mean, the tool that I kind of made fun of for a little bit, Ghostery, is actually a tool I really like because while I think the user-facing components could be a lot better, it actually does block a lot of request to known tracking domains. And so using things like Ghostery or other tracker blockers is something I recommend. And as part of, as I alluded to briefly, the browser privacy wars, like Mozilla Firefox actually now has tracking protection on by default. And you can actually even turn it to a strict tracking protection if you download, after you download Firefox, which has this. They go actually through. I've talked a lot to the Firefox team about our work, and there's actually it's been great because they've actually adopted a bunch of things that we suggested into Firefox. But they're really concerned with like the more they block, the more likely it is they're going to break something on the internet. And if you go to a web page and it doesn't work anymore, then you're going to abandon the browser, because like things like that your privacy is being protected, you don't really see. Like there's no very visual, your privacy is being protected. And so I think it's a really interesting HCI question of like, how do you convince people of something as like opaque as privacy protection that you're seeing this benefit, whereas like for privacy protection, sometimes you accidentally break things, and you definitely see when you click play on the video and it doesn't play. That's very visceral. And very interesting HCI question. But yeah, I'd say turn on your browser tracking settings, download tools like Ghostery.
Sorry, I wasn't asking so much about how to stop it, but how to find out who's doing it.
Right. Oh yeah, great question. Yeah, so there's off the shelf, Ghostery does tell you again like this what companies are tracking you, but like a lot of it is it's hard to try and get a sense of this. And like, so that's been driving a lot of our work, which is like, how do you actually, what do people actually want to know in detail about, what the tracking that's happening, and how do we present it to people? But yeah, I mean, if you download Ghostery, you'll see like, you go to the Boston Globe and like a whole litany of trackers will pop up of all these people are tracking you. But again, you don't really get a sense of like, what they know about you. And again, Firefox, they have this thing they introduced last year called the protections dashboard, where you can again see a little bit of how much you're blocking tracking. But yeah, it's a lot to be done from the visualization standpoint, which is what my students are busy hopefully improving.
Thank you.
Great. Christina Oliveira had a question.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Great presentation. Really interesting. I have a background in digital advertising and UX. So it was really interesting to hear from the other perspective and how you inquired and how you researched all this stuff. I just had a really small question because I also do UX testing, and how you phrase a question really impacts the response that you get. And on one piece of the research, you mentioned that you informed people that in the survey they could click prefer not to answer and they wouldn't be penalized for it. And that kind of triggered a question in my head that what were there other questions that you considered asking them besides inform? Like, I was wondering if there's like a reverse psychology aspect to it, like I won't be penalized, so I'll never skip that question, or it just for some reason it stuck out for me. I just would like hear what you had to say about that.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, great question. And I am like, I'm super OCD about survey wording for the exact that. Yeah, so with all of our surveys, we do a bunch of pilot testing before we roll it out to people. First, within our research group, and then other people. We so that interpretation hadn't come up that I remember, and Sophie can correct me if I'm wrong. And then, but of course, if it doesn't come up in piloting, it could still be a bug in the real thing. And so, I guess the reason I think it's not likely that people misinterpreted those instructions is we actually, after the debriefing, asked people why they chose to answer these questions. And again, Sophie, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember kind of these like kind of misinterpretations of what they were or were not allowed to do showing up. Like, there were definitely some people who clearly had like skipped over that part and were still concerned about, if they didn't answer questions, then their work would be rejected in the crowd working platforms. And because they have a reputation system, and a lot of people do actually rely on these crowd working platforms as a major source of income, people are justifiably nervous about that. So, I think, it's something we could definitely revisit of like, are there different instructions that would have encouraged people to click it more? And actually I was peeking at some of the other questions in the chat, and someone had pointed out, what I assume was like, looking at the visual design of the prefer not to say button, and whether that, visual design could have contributed to people's reluctance to click the button. And I mean, we basically used the Qualtrics default formatting for buttons, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of a bit of a garish, ugly button. So we definitely could have, that's something to revisit. Because I mean, this is like a lot of research. You have a particular apparatus studying a given question, and the way you gain confidence is by using that same apparatus again and again, like we did first as a UChicago study, then as a deception IIDR study, but then also basically trying parallel methods with slightly different apparatuses to try and investigate the same things.
Yeah. Very cool. Just one follow-up. I mean, everyone might be interested to know that there was a recent study that the wording of when you're doing usability testing, at the end of it, sometimes you ask, is there something else you want to add that I didn't ask you? And they found that more people responded if you say, is there anything else you want to tell me, instead of, is there something else you want to tell me? And people reach far into their minds and come up with something more often if they say anything else. I was fascinated by that. So anyway, thank you so much for a great presentation.
Great. I had one question. I was wondering if you think that the fact that these were crowd workers impacted their willingness to answer the questions and not use the option of not wanting to answer, just because they're more used to working with whatever platform you're working with them on, and they're more trusting, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I think the this idea that like, I mentioned this like extraordinarily briefly in the talk, that like people trusted Prolific and assume they must be vetting these studies when they're not actually vetting these studies, unless you specifically ask them, like we did, because we were doing things that violated their terms of service, so we wanted to clear it. And so and I think so we had done, actually I didn't mention this in the talk, we had done a few dozen people through an in-person protocol. And we actually recruited those people from Craigslist. And so they came to campus. Actually, Sophie would like stand in front of our building with like a little cardboard sign and a clipboard inviting people to the study. And so there, you know, we have this, they were clearly walking into a U Chicago building. And so there was some trust built in there. And so I think the ideal would be to, like, if I got my students to dress up like in like, you know, sketchy uniforms and have like a fake company just like recruit on street corners in Chicago, maybe people would be less trusting. But yeah, I think there's, you know, this was part of our process of unpacking the results that we didn't think we would get. Like we had this hypothesis that people would be creeped out and not disclose as much information. They would prefer not to say more often. We didn't find that. And so that's how, yeah, trying to look for these explanations and trying to break it apart. We added a bunch of questions to the, you know, when we redid the survey as not U Chicago, about trying to understand like potential explanations. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot more to be done. And yeah, I personally find this kind of like human subjects research into how people think about privacy and how they make decisions super fascinating. And it's kind of, you know, very much the academic field, part of the academic field that I trained in.
Okay, were there any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming, and Blase and Sophie for the wonderful presentation, and hopefully we'll see all of you next month on December 8th.